Okay, let's start. Good afternoon to everyone. Good morning in the US. Thank you for attending this webinar. Thank you, the panelists, for accepting our invitation to collaborate with our report on how cities have been managing the COVID pandemic, and also to accept sharing your participating in this debate and sharing your thoughts and views today with us. Let me briefly introduce how we are going to proceed with the webinar. I will give you a first and very brief presentation of our CIDOB report on cities and COVID. Next, we will have a first round of intervention among the panelists, 5 minutes each panelist, to reflect on their contributions to the report and to introduce some broader issues and questions. Second round of intervention I will invite the panelists to address a specific question that we sent each of the panelists, and here they will have another 5 minutes to respond and to address this specific question. Then we will go through a common questions on international cooperations on cities diplomacy, how cities diplomacy have been key to address this outbreak from cities' perspective. Here, I'll ask the panelists to give us a short response. And to conclude, I will open the floor and the debate to the audience, and ask the audience to send questions or to pose questions to the four panelists. The audience, the participants in this seminar have the option to start sending their questions by now. There's an option in your YouTube connections that allows you to use the chat to send us the questions. So please feel free to share your thoughts and your questions to the panelists starting now. Okay. Well, very briefly, the CIDOB report that we are presenting today analyzes how 12 cities around the world, 6 cities in Europe, Milano, Vienna, Zurich, Berlin, London, and Barcelona, Chicago and San Francisco in the US, Buenos Aires in Argentina, Cape Town in South Africa, Melbourne in Australia, and Hong Kong have been managing the COVID outbreak during these months, and also analyzing the lessons that can we extract from those experiences that can be useful to guide future urban action. This includes learning to govern complex, uncertain scenarios by placing decentralization, cooperation, and resilience at the heart of public policies. Rethinking cities to encourage social distancing and make them healthier and more livable without sacrificing density. We think this is also crucial. And tackling the deep economic recession and social emergence without neglecting the commitments that cities have addressed in the field of climate action, climate transition. It is clear that we are facing an urban crisis. The COVID has put cities at the front line. However, have all the cities got the same capacities and resources to provide efficient and contextualized responses to that outbreak, to that challenge? To what extent has collaborative governance been relevant to build those effective responses? collaboration between to what extent collaboration between cities has been key at the metropolitan level, at national level, but also at international level. To what extent collaboration with other spheres of government has been key to build those efficient responses, or with other stakeholders that operate at urban in the urban dimension. We have seen very interesting and innovative experiences between civil society organizations, between knowledge-based institutions working together with cities, trying to provide efficient solutions with the private sector. We have been trying to tackle and to analyze those alliances, those experiences. And finally, to what extent we are facing the opportunity to rethink the city. To what extent the COVID has been giving us the opportunity to rethink mobility, to rethink the use of public space, to address digital transition, and especially the digital divide, to address housing issues and the right to housing, or to build new patterns of consumption, new patterns of productions, and in this dimension to build alliances with science, with innovation. So we are facing key challenges to redefine the city, and I think this is really exciting. And to tackle those questions and more, I will invite now the four panelists for a first round of reflections based in their contributions. So specifically based on the analysis that they have provided on their cities, on the reflections on their cities. We will start by Philipp Rode. He is Executive Director at LSE Cities at the London School of Economics, and he has been in charge of analyzing the experience of London. So, Philipp, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Agustí, and also many thanks to CIDOB for leading this initiative, which is obviously incredibly important for the kind of communities we are representing. So if I now come to London and I elaborate on sort of my perspective on what has happened here, it's possibly a more critical account. And I want to put this into context right from the beginning. What I'm really referring to here mainly is an emergency governance or COVID-19 governance approach during the emergency situation. And I think that's the one where sort of my comments are maybe more critical and possibly also reflected by what city government and colleagues across the UK would identify. This is entirely different from what is slowly emerging as an exit phase governance, and also the governance of the new normal, where I'm actually far more hopeful that London may be able to be a reference case of far greater optimism and real contribution to innovation. So why has it been hard? London has been hit hard for the obvious reasons. What is unfortunate that in a European context, it was delayed, and it was perfectly expectable. And looking back, it is, of course, very unfortunate, very sad indeed, that the UK as a whole, but then also London as I will say in a moment, more or less a function of what our national government decides, didn't in some ways react early enough. And I think that's the single biggest institutional failing we are seeing, whether that's now due to the way governance operates across different spheres, or whether there's also a political perspective behind, we can unpack further. But it's the first thing we must recognize, that we are having here a delayed reaction compared to many other European countries that were also ahead of the infection rates. Now, the second main thing is the UK is a highly centralized system. Yes, London has its own mayor. Yes, we have underneath the mayor local government. But essentially in this hot phase of responding to the emergency, they acted as implementation agencies, responding to the big decisions, the strategic decisions on the lockdown, on the type of lockdown, which the national government essentially fixed for all municipalities, for all regions, at least at the level of England. Many of them were more or less then also consistent across the four nations of the UK. So we are also therefore seeing a local administration which is at the receiving end of national government grants and is not equipped with monies which they can then earmark, dedicate, and also shift around in this emergency moment. And on top of that, also the main regulatory interventions followed the same logic, waiting essentially for national government to essentially define the details of what a lockdown means in London streets, rather than, as we have seen it in other parts of the world, where this was a regional approach initially, then a bit negotiated with different tiers of government, and ended up again being a much more regional approach. The final thing to maybe highlight is that, as always, where you have, I think, a degree of over-centralization, maybe it does encourage a considerable degree of taking ownership at the very local level. So the famous mutual aid groups, which popped up not only in London, but across the UK, are possibly also a counterbalance to the enormous distance which otherwise you see between individual citizens and local communities on the ground, and then the national government with very abstract relationships, with very abstract also legislation trying to address the crisis. And that has done something to, of course, all cities we will be talking today about, but it has done something to London, a city which is characterized by possibly, great levels of anonymity, great levels of people keeping to their own business, and often not really engaging with their local street, with their local communities. And it's at that level where I think we have seen a real new or new relationships being emerging and partially also stepping into this void which was certainly created in the initial days. Now, in terms of the broader lessons and how we move forward, and again to also emphasize a bit why I'm more optimistic as we move forward, I think when we are reflecting on COVID-19 governance, we have to more broadly understand whether we are interested in broader new approaches to radical and rapid action across the board for whatever reason, whether it's more specific to a health emergency or other routine emergencies, or indeed whether it is something in relation to a global emergency. And you already referenced climate change, and that's one of these global emergencies where indeed I think London and London boroughs have already shown great leadership before the current crisis, have thought very well about how do you actually democratize to a certain degree, at least, these new demands of really overnight implementing radical change. And the idea of citizen assemblies, the experiments that are taking place out of the climate emergency movement, I think will be something we will be able to build on. The mayor has now just set up a recovery board and a recovery task force. And I think there will be a lot of really positive noise around interpreting, rethinking the new normal, and ensure that it will respond to all the other crises you already referred to. Let me stop here.
Okay, thanks a lot, Philipp. Maybe now to elaborate a little bit on some of these governance challenges that the emergency has emerged. I think metropolitan issues for big areas have been key to manage all these threats. So I will go to Ian Klaus, Chicago. He's a fellow at the Chicago Council within the Global Cities program at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and ask him to elaborate a little bit on the experience of the San Francisco Bay Area and there the metropolitan challenges.
Gracias, Agustí. Y Hannah, y felicidades por hacer. Gracias por la invitación. And let me also just say, it's a great pleasure to be on this Zoom panel with Susan and Philipp, from whom over the years, particularly when we were going through Habitat 3, I've learned so much. So whatever I say with a little bit of humility, knowing how long they've been thinking very seriously about these things. I'm not going to take too long to provide an overview of the San Francisco Bay Area story, particularly since we're going to talk about metropolitan approaches, and I think the Bay Area is a particularly important place to think about that. But let me just provide some points for those who are joining us and for us in general. The San Francisco Bay Area is keen to think of itself as unique. It's part of its culture. But in many ways, as a metropolitan region, in San Francisco as a city, it's like many others in the global north today. It's suffering a transportation crisis, even though it, of course, is home to inventing Uber and Lyft. It's home to Airbnb, but it's suffering a massive, massive housing crisis. And along with those technology companies and those two crises, there's a significantly and worsening inequality across the San Francisco Bay Area. All of those things argue for a metropolitan approach to thinking about it, which is consistent with the way we're thinking about cities more generally, I would argue. But we'll get back to the big picture. I thought it was interesting that Philipp mentioned London reacting quite late. When I was reading this series, I have to say as an aside, Susan, did South Africa on May 15th? And Barcelona was 14 or 15 in Spain. San Francisco and the surrounding counties, the 7 counties, went together into shelter in place on May 17. And I'm just struck as an aside in the psychology of 3 places, Spain, California, and South Africa, almost within 3 days, all going into complete lockdown. It's quite remarkable what happened across the planet. And how quickly it happened in so many places, I think. San Francisco, in particular, San Mateo County and Santa Clara County, which are 2 major counties south of the city of San Francisco, in what's called the South Bay, or otherwise known as Silicon Valley, were actually initially hotspots on the West Coast, along with Seattle, for COVID. In the wake of the lockdown, of the shelter-in-place order, as we call it here, it seems to have been quite successful, and no longer do they even register in the top 50 counties in the U.S. That's something of a success story. It speaks to the functioning of 7 regions as 7 counties as a metropolitan region, but it's not without its nuances, obviously, or its problems. I would note that the drop in traffic, for instance, in San Mateo or Santa Clara County, San Francisco County, is not mirrored in the rural areas that provide all the food for the San Francisco Bay Area. There, the traffic reduction was much lighter. And so the patterns aren't consistent once you branch out into the urban-rural divide. And of course, the approaches for even something as simple as reporting cases differed within the 7 counties. So not all the 7 counties, for instance, provided racial details or ethnic details on the reporting around COVID cases publicly, for instance. And so even though the orders were uniform, the ways in which people treated questions around equity actually differed across the counties. Just a couple observations, if you and Philipp frame this in reasons about optimism, on long-term implications for the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm struck in many of these conversations with something of a paradox or a duality where our ambitions have increased while the resources to pursue them have decreased quite notably. The fiscal arrangements in the U.S. are, of course, different from those in, say, London or Barcelona, but cities in the U.S. are facing an immediate budget crisis. They're responsible for generating a lot of their own revenues through taxes. So San Francisco is estimating $1.7 billion deficit that wasn't initially expected. I'm speaking here this morning in Palo Alto, where we are facing a $40 million budget deficit. And just some small examples of where that matters. In the housing crisis, initially, the bill that was going through the state capitol was going to include the construction of public housing. That has been removed from that bill. Or to be even more practical, in the city of Palo Alto, where I am, the public arts budget has been cut, but the community, inspired by the Black members of the community, is putting up Black Lives Matter art in the city from a budget that has been cut. And so we're tackling problems that we need to tackle but of course, in a budgetary situation that is in fact reduced. If things returned to the old normal, according to a lot of the research, I'm thinking here about the work research group out of Vanderbilt, the San Francisco Bay Area is one of the places that in fact faces the biggest transportation increase in transportation crisis, worsening of the transportation crisis. If people stop taking public transportation and instead return to single occupancy vehicles, the implications for the Bay Area are essentially catastrophic. Which leads to the final point, which I think is worth discussion. Having learned a lot from Susan and Philip and many others over the years about what makes up a city, of course, it's rarely City Hall. Here, inevitably, it always brings the conversation, includes the influence of so-called big tech. And an interesting survey occurred about a month ago where they surveyed 4,000 workers in the tech industry, 2/3 of whom said they would leave the San Francisco Bay Area if they didn't have to work here. This is happening at a moment where firms like Twitter are telling people they don't ever have to come back to work, where Facebook is considering the same policy. And so the implications for the San Francisco Bay Area of COVID, I think, extend incredibly far into this question of the future of work and technology, which is almost impossible to wrap your head around right now. But we're already seeing some of those implications with rents falling in San Francisco, Palo Alto, Menlo Park, et cetera. So I'll leave it at that and pick up the conversation on metro region areas a bit later. Thank you, Agustí.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Now we move towards Cape Town, and we have Susan Parnell. She's professor of human geography at the University of Cape Town and also University of Bristol. And she has been working and analyzing how the city in South Africa has been tackling, being a little bit the hub of the pandemic, tackling the issue of the outbreak. Susan.
Hi, great. Thanks, everybody. And very lovely to get comparative perspectives. I have to say, you'll see my backdrop is of Cape Town, an aerial shot, which is as close as I can get at the moment. I was actually supposed to be there during lockdown, and as many of us were, we got stuck in parts of the world we hadn't anticipated for that moment. I just wanted to say that my comments are not an assessment. As both Ian and Philipp alluded to that, they're a reflection of some of the dynamics that are there. And with Kara Carson, who's one of my PhD students, we focus very explicitly on the first phases of the experience of the pandemic in the city and come up with some remarks, which I'll come to in a second. But for those of you who don't know the city, I think it may be useful to begin to start to think about what do we need to know about a place in order to begin to think about how and why it responds in the way that it does. So clearly there are very particular things about London that make and characterize the pandemic in that place, and they're different from what we see in Barcelona or anywhere else. Now, so Cape Town is the entry point for the pandemic for the whole of the African continent. And in part, that's because it's the tourist hub. It's globally connected. So I think one of the things the first thing that it does, of course, is to rupture this idea that we have African experiences of a pandemic, or that we have things which are somehow put some places outside of comparative forms and common forms of experience. There are nonetheless things which make a place very particular and possibly very vulnerable, as well as potentially quite resilient. So for example, the Cape Town is the city in the world that has the highest incidence of tuberculosis, a respiratory disease. It's also got exceptionally high levels of diabetes, which we now know, which we didn't know right at the beginning, makes one particularly vulnerable to COVID. In addition to that, there are about 13% of people who are HIV positive, so they have compromised immune systems. So you're dealing with a population that is already exposed to and vulnerable to the pandemic in ways that make it different from cities elsewhere. The other thing which I think is tricky in talking about Cape Town is that it's a city that's characterized simultaneously by exceptionally high and exceptionally low densities. So if you begin to see the American debate beginning to kind of emerge, the question about what's the role of density, we might come to that later on, is quite difficult to talk about in the Cape Town context without getting down to the detail, because there really is this enormous variation which is there. It's a community that is both very globally connected. I've already mentioned tourism, and it's a community that is simultaneously quite locked in to very particular neighborhood dynamics, where some people never even get beyond where they can walk from their own place of residence. Okay, so I think those sorts of things are important. And perhaps what's most important is one of the points which we bring out in the paper, which turns out to have been an enormous strength for Cape Town, is that it is a city with a history of mobilization. Okay, it's a city with a deeply political past, and the past matters. And it doesn't just matter in the sense of the inequalities that it's perpetuated, because it has done that, but it is also important in understanding the organizational structures, the attitudes, the social connections, and what we might call the social compacts that have emerged in the city. The points at where city leaders, whether they are civil society activists who came out of the HIV movement, or whether they are anti-eviction campaigners, or whether they're members of the opposition who have had to engage with government who's part of the ruling party over a longer period of time. So it's a city with a history of having to sit down together, and a city with a history of naming difficult issues. And that, I think, turned out to be quite advantageous in the beginnings and the comings together of what actually turned out to be a very effective early mobilization. And as I said, I'm not evaluating, and I don't think we're in a position to evaluate just yet. You could give a kind of over-glorified view of Cape Town's response to the pandemic and say, actually, less than 1,500 people have died, in notwithstanding all of those vulnerabilities that I've talked about. Or you could conversely say there's been horrific violence on the street, people have been evicted. It's actually not what I want to get into at this point. What I wanted to do was to do as we do in the paper that is now online. And thank you so much for pulling these really important, I think, city-led initiatives together, which was to talk really about what has effectively happened. And perhaps the most important point for understanding the response to the early responses to the pandemic is to say that in South Africa, as many cases across the world, health is not a local competence. Okay? It's not something which falls under the purview of local government. And depending on how the powers and functions are distributed, when you have to react to a crisis, the responsible body in a way has to lead. And in the Cape Town case, that in fact was the provincial government on the health front in particular. So it's national and provincial government who are at the forefront of the health response. But part of what we're here to discuss is the fact that actually COVID is only partly a biomedical problem. The really significant issues are around housing, they're around food, they're around what you do with your children when they can't go to school, and how do you galvanize and pull together the different stakeholders in response to something which is so pervasive and so far-reaching that it touches absolutely every citizen in the city. And there are at least two initiatives that I think, or perhaps three, that one wants to highlight. One is that actually the history of intergovernmental cooperation and the practice of intergovernmental cooperation becomes fundamental. In other words, how effective has devolution been over the last decade or 2 decades, in the sense not just of what it told cities they had to do, but in the sense that it was understood who in government needed to come together to do what, and how one could join up interventions around transport restrictions, schooling restrictions, new hospitals, and the supply line for food. And that's happened reasonably well. Partly, I think, because people have always landed up having to talk together. So governments have to work together. And in this case, local government has been relatively marginalized. The province and the city makes up 2/3 of the city of Cape Town makes up 2/3 of the Western Cape, has had to engage very actively with other spheres and tiers of government. That's the first thing. The second thing is that government has not been able to do this on its own. And it turns out, in fact, that actually government's been much more heavy-footed, in perhaps some ways that one would expect, particularly when you remember that almost all civil servants had to go home and were in lockdown like everybody else. Very difficult for government to be agile and quick. And actually civil society, which has been much better at using using online facilities of various kinds, has been able to mobilize and been able to bring people together very quickly, partly to protest, but partly to support. And so 2 initiatives, and I'll end on this, for me have been really interesting and illuminating. One is, and you will see no doubt quite a lot written about this in the months to come, the community action networks, which are born out of the anti-eviction politics. They don't come out of nowhere. They're not epistemic in a kind of miraculously, COVID emerged and 24 hours later we had these community action networks. They're based on and grounded in much longer traditions of social mobilization. But what they have been able to do is to create, whether it's Facebook or other platforms, linkages which have been both neighborhood oriented, internal in other words, to give local information about services, but have also managed to connect poor neighborhoods to better resourced neighborhoods in ways that I think are very significant. But for me, in a way, the one which is much less in the public eye has been an initiative that was born out of the closure of schools. Schools got less than 24 hours to close. And so the provincial government ran an aftercare program for kids in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And suddenly their program was gone. Now what do you do? And they have been able to try and reconfigure and mobilize to initiate a cultural program for youth based on WhatsApp, because data is scarce, with a set of prizes which are to give more data so that people get access to this very, very precious commodity of expression and connectivity, and have run a series of competitions for young people in disadvantaged neighborhoods to tell the world about what it means to live in Cape Town under COVID. And I think what we take from that is that under conditions of emergency, everybody has a tendency to want to pull together. That will fragment, and it does fragment, and it becomes more contentious. But the way that happens, the configuration of it, the strength of those interactions, is not only a product of very short-term leadership and energy and power, though it is that. One can find individuals who've been amazing catalysts and energizers of that space. But perhaps more profoundly, it relies on the way that we always run cities, the way that we always bring people in to engage with each other, to work with each other. And COVID, perhaps more than anything, demonstrates that actually cities are incredibly complex. One set and one cohort of people can't do things entirely on their own. And so that kind of collaboration is absolutely imperative. How well it works depends at least in part on trust, but it also depends on the history of the contestations over urban space and urban rights. I'll leave it there.
Great, Susan. Thank you. Very, very, very interesting and inspiring. Let's move now to Barcelona. There we have my colleague Hannah Abdullah. She's going to present the main results of the Barcelona experience and how the city has been tackling this outbreak. Hannah is a research fellow here at CIDOB in our Global Cities program. Hannah, you have the floor.
Thank you, Agustí. And I'd like to join Agustí in thanking the 3 panelists for their very interesting contributions to our report and for participating in this panel discussion. And I also come to this discussion from a, let's say, humble point, given that you're all experts who have worked on these issues for decades, probably. So I think one of the issues that the report raised, and which Susan has also emphasized a few times now in her intervention, is that this health crisis we're currently facing and many other impending crises like the climate crisis cannot be managed and tackled by public authorities alone, but will require intense collaboration with other stakeholders ranging from civil society to the knowledge sector and the private sector. So in this context, a major task for public authorities is to provide an enabling environment for cross-sector collaboration that is innovative, effective, but also and essentially inclusive. And in the case of the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen many collaborations between the public and the private sector, but perhaps more, we've seen public administrations collaborating with civil society, especially at the local level. And Susan has mentioned some of the examples of initiatives in Cape Town. So civil society has really stepped in to complement and fill the gaps in government action. And this is also something we have seen in Barcelona, and this is a topic that I cover in the article I co-authored with Jordi Reynés. And the initiative that we looked at is a collaboration between the city's maker community, so people who use digital technologies like 3D printers to design gadgets that address all kinds of problems. So this maker community collaborated with the City Council's network of Fab Labs, which are called Ateneos de Fabricación. And together they produced and distributed urgently needed protective gear, from face masks to facial screens and so on, often using 3D printers, their personal 3D printers at home. I think the case of the coronavirus makers, this is the name of this movement, is an interesting one for two reasons. First of all, the initial impetus for this action came actually from the maker community, so from civil society. And I think this is exemplary of many initiatives we've seen in cities around the world, that civil society often responded faster and in more agile ways to the emergency than public authorities. And the case of the coronavirus makers also highlights how cities have to engage with civil society in policymaking processes, in particular, not just civil society, but also local talent. And by talent, I don't just mean high-profile international research centers, but also institutes like these Fab Labs, which we have here in Barcelona, and which are open to everyone and which closely connect with the needs and interests of local communities. So a particular characteristic of these local Fab Labs here in Barcelona is that they are not just digital innovation labs, but they actually prioritize social inclusion and social innovation. A second reason for why the coronavirus maker case is an interesting one is because it relates very much to the debate that has emerged since COVID-19 around the advantages and disadvantages of urban density, which has also been mentioned a few times now, and which has been driven very much by American scholars and commentators. So there has been a lot of criticism of urban density for spreading the virus and for accelerating its impact. But actually, so far, there's no consistent data to support these claims. Instead, what urban density has also provided, and what we've seen in this case of the coronavirus makers, is that it drives innovative responses and solutions to the crisis. So the success of these coronavirus makers depended very much on Barcelona's rich digital and social innovation ecosystem, and also the ability of this community to then collect globally with other knowledge platforms and other movements that were engaging in similar activities. So in a way to conclude, these innovation ecosystems, be they digital, scientific, economic, or social, have been playing a key role, I think, in tackling the current health crisis, and they will play a key role in tackling future crises like climate change. And urban density is really key to maintaining these ecosystems. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah. To deepen on all this and to open this second round, Philipp, in what ways do you think decentralized countries with strong local and regional governments have been more able to deal in a more effective way with the outbreak of the COVID?
Thank you. I mean, it's one of these very fundamental questions we, I guess, all ask if we're interested in urban governance and governance more broadly. And even if you look into emergency governance literature specifically, this tension around subsidiarity on the one hand, scaling to the maximum possible level down to where the action happens versus strategic direction is, of course, a very well-known tension. And it's also playing out in front of our eyes. I think before we rush, and I will give a few answers to the question, but before we rush into conclusions, we have to be incredibly careful with the evidence base that's currently presented to us. And not only differentiate what essentially can be very different local conditions other than governance and even other than politics that lead to different infection rates and to different, therefore, the big metrics we are now all comparing, the death rate and of course infection rate, how that is actually happening and what's determining these. It's too early to really be conclusive on any of this. More specifically around governance, very hard to differentiate what's politics, actual hands-on substantive interventions versus then the division of powers and the broader government frameworks. Now, there is also a third issue when we think about decentralized countries with more devolved powers. There's quite naturally a greater range of efficiency levels as to the responses. You take the US, some cities are doing really well, or states, others less so. Same in Brazil, same in Switzerland, same in Germany. But where we look at the more, let's call them centralized systems, it's sort of a composite measure across the board. So all of this doesn't very much help at the moment with the comparative perspective. And still, standing or sitting here today in London, there is certainly a perspective in this city and in this country where one does look with a certain envy into systems that have greater degrees of devolution, for sure. Yeah, and any person who is working on cities in the UK has for long been pointing out that the UK is overly centralized, and that's not working particularly well for its cities. But equally, the long list of cities that have problems to their responses, although they are in a more devolved and a decentralized system. I mentioned already US, Brazil, even Switzerland. I had conversations with colleagues there where it was reported back that it felt too much like all these individual cantons are doing too many, taking too many differentiated actions, which are no longer coherent. I guess my own home country, Germany, at the moment at least, is a bit seen as a case where things seem to be working quite well. Again, it's the outsider's perspective. The complexities of what's happening on the ground and the battles of different states coordinating actions, also requires a lot of energy. So maybe what's fair to conclude at this point, yes, subsidiarity is great, but there needs to be a strong strategic steer, and we certainly must not give up on cross-boundary collaboration. If anything, that was actually missing. And I'll come back to the second part of the question around, international collaboration. The crisis is simply too complex for one government. And it's multi-level governance in its broadest sense, not just different tiers of government that needs to come together, but also different players. More specifically for cities, I think we have a very strong agenda in front of us where we need to urbanize the response. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, make the response suit the conditions of cities and the particularities. And I think where we get into really dangerous territory if policymakers, officials start commenting, engaging with ultra-urban issues like density, housing, higher density mixed-use housing, public transport, which they actually don't know about. That's where I think cities need to push back and be absolutely clear that they themselves have the knowledge, the expertise to actually report back to national governments or even state governments on what is urgently needed. And the London story on the areas where, let's say an urban view really matters is encouraging when we think of public transport. One of the few areas where the mayor has really full control and where, as a result, a very strong lobby was put in place to get the bailout and get national government to actually pay 1.6 billion in order to maintain services. The mayor understands public transport, so important. Not only public transport, but urban transport. We have now a £15 per day congestion charge because, of course, we know the biggest risk London is facing at the moment is to get stuck in congestion by people swapping back to car use. So that is something, again, I think urban leadership is required to alert us to this risk. The very innovative approaches around remode, bring people into walking and cycling and redistribute street space accordingly, retime, really understand the schedule of the city and see where there's slack, where there's opportunity to have people travel at different times. And then once again, rescale our urban spaces, whether indoors and outdoors accordingly, is a task which urban professionals, urban leaders, and urban citizens need to lead. This cannot be done by remote ministries that ultimately don't differentiate between urban, rural, semi-urban, or indeed suburban contexts. London's Street Space program is maybe the best example of all, where we are now quite radically addressing not just the COVID crisis, but essentially we are rolling out the policies which any sensible transport policy in response to the climate crisis should have actually done already 10 years ago. Now, just 3 points on the international collaboration, because yes, subsidiarity is great. The scaling to particular local and city conditions is important, but we have a few risks here which we need to be aware of. And that's where the question about why is international collaboration so important comes right at the heart of the answer. First of all, we need to find, of course, practices within related and similar contexts. And a city like London, by definition, then needs to go beyond the national scale. We need to learn from New York, from Tokyo, from city systems which are of a similar scale. And there is just no other in the UK. So that's a very banal first reason. The enormous uncertainty around all those issues, and Ian mentioned some of those, what's the future of office space? What's the future of urban housing? And this list is really endless. And we're just at the beginning of understanding whether this disruption has led to more permanent attitude change and economic disruption, or whether it will be back to some kind of normal which we have seen before the crisis. In order to really absorb what is happening, international observations and collaboration is critical. And then finally, and it's in some ways sad that I have to say this, but what we need to do at the moment most urgently is counterbalance inward-looking national and indeed nationalistic agendas. And that's where cities can really, with their international collaboration, their international perspectives, and their international populations, really hopefully lead us back on a path where we have been a few years ago and where, unfortunately, we have really been running into the wrong direction for too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Ian, now, yes, the metropolitan issue. Do you think that the crisis has underscored the urgence of establishing metropolitan governance mechanisms in all big urban areas?
Thanks, Agustí. And I'm often conscious in conversations like this that folks who join might have backgrounds in international relations or from the private sector and aren't part of the urban conversations that we're always part of. And even the municipal versus metropolitan distinction can lose some folks. And they also probably get lost when they wonder why we're not talking about cities, but instead talking about communities and urban areas and provincial governments and states as much as we talk about cities. But I think Philip and Susan and Hannah laid out the reasons why we do that. But of course, we've come to understand this crisis as one that can't be limited to municipal city borders and to solutions that can be offered by municipal government in City Hall. And in certain cases, the importance of the metropolitan approach is because cities have spawned out and connect cities, and others, particularly in the global south, you have urban areas that essentially it makes no sense whatsoever to think about it from a municipal perspective. So I think the nature of a pandemic, the nature of this disease, speak to the reasons that we take a metropolitan approach, but that's consistent with a whole bunch of other crises too. I'm not sure it's particularly unique. I'd like to say something a little bit about the devolution question, though, which obviously touches on metropolitan versus municipal, which is that one of the stories in the U.S. has in fact been that the emergent powers, because of the importance of the metropolitan approach, has in fact been the state capital and the governors. A little bit like the where does the power sit when it comes to health, in the example Susan gave. And so because you have to act quickly and across municipal regions, we've seen governors have a lead in a way that they haven't nearly similarly around other global crises, such as climate change. I think that's the first, particularly U.S. point worth making. And I'd like to just say something quickly about what Philipp said about national trends. One way of thinking about cities, and this will sort of blend the conversation about organizing across borders, is that they were supposed to be the most ambitious. So let's stick to activity among cities around climate change. National governments commit to 2% limit with the ambition of 1.5. Cities organized through networks say, no, we're just going to commit to limiting warming to 1.5. They were more ambitious than the international community. What we've seen in the case of COVID is, in fact, that cities have been the hedge against the failure of national government, in part because they've looked inward, in part because they've politicized the event. And so rather than being able to be more ambitious, to push frontiers, they've in fact just have to do the things that you would have hoped a functioning state and national government would do, and that the functioning international community would do. I think that's a sort of important point when it comes to devolution and the capacity of cities to urbanize the solution. A second point, and this might not go in the direction that we are, but I think it's often going right now in this conversation, it's easy to overlook the ways in which the national government, even in countries that are highly devolved, like the United States, takes basic acts that are hugely influential. So, for instance, the U.S. pushed back its tax state. I mean, this is in terms of administration, it was a massive decision that influenced hundreds of millions of lives. But sort of gets very little talk in terms of where power sits in the U.S. in response to COVID. But as an administrative decision, it was an absolutely essential one. The pursuit of vaccines is one of these things that requires international cooperation and public-private partnerships. But I don't know if it's being driven at the local level hugely. So even in places that are devolved, we're largely dependent in long-term solutions in certain issues around national capital. And just a note, since we're talking about international connectivity, Philipp noted that it's early, and Susan, the risk of offering assessments, and I wholeheartedly endorse it. Dr. Fauci, our CDC expert, truth speaker, celebrity, resistance hero, was asked if we were seeing a second wave, and he said, no, we're still in the first. But one of the things that's really striking about Hannah and Susan's piece to me is, of course, it's early in the COVID story. We're still in the first, but it's really late or in the middle of other stories. And we're in the middle, or we're late, or we're in the prime of the story of the social capacities of the groups that are organized against apartheid and HIV/AIDS, or the maker communities of Barcelona. And so we inserted a new story, but a lot of the really wonderful responses, or strong responses, or important histories that are going to emerge from this are from organizations that were already fully established and active. In their stories, they were ready to go and be there for their communities and their cities.
Great, thank you. This is to the audience. Please share your questions, your reflections with us. Use your chat that you have available on your YouTube connection, so we can post your questions, or we can share your reflections with the panel. Okay. Now, Susan. What can we learn? I think you, in your article and now in your intervention, you have really well explained these inspiring experiences from civil society organizations co-producing solutions with the city governments or with the local governments. What can we learn from the flexibility and inventiveness, the capacity to innovate from those civil society organization approaches and efforts?
Thanks. Those of you who study cities will know that we talk a lot about co-production. We don't always talk about co-production in response to a crisis. But I think one has to be a little bit careful at this point. I am, like many other people, a very strong advocate. And the COVID cases, as Hannah, I think, describes very well, and Ian's just explained very articulately, builds on the momentum and the organizational structures and the depth of leadership that exists beyond the state. And in addition to that, cities are made up of and characterized, and the most wonderful cities to live in are those that have got very active, deep civil society organizations, whether those are religious or whether they are protest movements or whether they are sports or whatever they are. But then they don't always come in the size and shape that we think they do. And frankly, sometimes they are even political parties. But I think one of the things which we do need to be alert to is that the notion of co-production is actually implies working with the state. And it's the other way around from how we've typically thought about it. And I think what we will see in the urban response to COVID is that, particularly as we get into the slightly longer, more boring, really important stuff about how do you build a recovery, how do you get the high street to work, how do you actually begin to raise taxes again so that you can actually redistribute to the poor, how do you ensure that you have literate citizens so that they can engage in social media, how do you ensure that actually you have fiber in or whatever your form of connectivity is across the city? How do you ensure that your civic leaders are of a kind and a caliber that they gain from their engagement with city leaders from other places? And it seems to me that it's in that context of co-production that what we have to be able to do is, certainly we need, and this is not a new argument, but it's just heightened, it's amplified in the context of COVID. What we really need to do is to understand that there are multiple forms of expertise, there are multiple forms of capacity, and there are multiple institutions that have to come together to make cities what they are. By definition, several of us have said this already, so it's not a one-horse show. You have to have lots and lots of different parties. And in the context of co-production, we, again, I think need to be not entirely romantic. It's not a case of everybody just throws in and does as best they can. It's like a good orchestra. Knowing what people do well, knowing when they are at their best, and ensuring that they are able to thrive under those conditions is really, really important. So I think what both Hannah's and our paper demonstrates is that civil society, they're like sprinters quite often. They're really good at getting up and off. They also tend to have some other kinds of civil society who are really good at the long haul and holding government to account. But you don't get co-production if you haven't also got people in government who share those values. And I think what the South African case and the Cape Town case in particular demonstrates is that where you have leaders, whether they're political leaders or whether they are expert leaders, scientists, professionals, who are alert to the multiple forms of knowledge that need to be brought to bear to respond to complex problems. It's only when you're able to do that, and frankly, the role of scholars in that regard, I think, is really important. I work with on a project called Peak Urban, and one of the things which they talk about there is that what you need is to be able to track the long-term changes. You actually need to be able to document those. You need to understand that's whether that's in civil society, in protests, in homelessness, in the burden of disease, in public transport. But you need to know and understand then what that happens when it comes together. When those things interplay, what's the relationship between really hard protest and the support of civil society for actions of the state? And how do we ensure that we harness those to actually achieve the major reforms that are required in order to make cities healthy? And it's in understanding what some of those technical shifts and changes are, which are not going to be quick. Every experience of major reconstruction, whether it's after the Second World War, the end of apartheid, after massive forms of devolution in India or Brazil or wherever, as demonstrated, it takes a long time to change. So your co-production is not just with one civil society group. Co-production is a governmentality. It's a headspace that says that there are many people who know and care and can contribute to the way that we run cities to make them healthy. And when our cities are healthy, then we know that actually the world is in a much healthier space. So I think it's, for me, there needs to be a kind of a co-production 2.0, where we begin to think in a post-COVID kind of way, which is at scale, not just local, which is slightly longer term and must take on substantive issues, some of which are about expression and voice and ensuring that everybody's on board, but some of which are about really boring details about things like how dense should a city be and how do we ensure that we change it, and how actually can we get public transport to work again so that people feel safe getting onto it, and how do we ensure that for those who can't get there, there's enough money to begin to pay them some form of social protection that's there. So that debate, that collective debate, for me, is that essence of co-production for a post-COVID world.
Thanks. Hannah, many cities are developing long-term recovery strategies for building back more resiliently and sustainably. What areas should those cities or those strategies focus on?
Thanks, Agustí. Yeah, I think it has been mentioned many times in the past few weeks that the crisis we're currently dealing with doesn't just pose many challenges, but it's also an opportunity to rethink our cities and to build back better rather than just returning to business as usual. And I think what Philipp just mentioned about trying to urbanize the response is key here. So cities basically trying to adapt their responses also to their needs and interests. And I think a lot of the policy debates and actions around the ambition to build back better have focused on two key issues that are intimately connected with the creation of healthier cities. And the first has been focusing recovery plans and strategies on building more environmentally sustainable cities. And for example, as Tobias Sevi, one of the contributors to the report, points out in his piece on Milan, actually the high pollution levels in the city favored the spread and impact of the virus. So investment in the ecological transition is not only needed to tackle the climate change crisis, but also to create healthier cities. And the second key issue that I think many recovery plans are focusing on, many long-term recovery plans, is the creation of more inclusive and equitable cities. So as Susan also mentions in her piece on Cape Town, this current health crisis really brought to the surface many systemic inequalities in cities that already existed prior to the crisis, but that became more visible with the lockdown and other measures that were taken. And the fact that poor and overcrowded communities with less or no access to public and social services were hit hardest by the pandemic only confirms this analysis. So now, while these issues of creating more ecologically sustainable cities and equitable cities have been on the table for some time and have been debated for quite a while, what the crisis has done, it has really accelerated and expanded the implementation of innovative policies and strategies to address these issues in a holistic manner. So in a manner that takes on board all three issues: health, climate, and equity. And I think there are three, let's say, holistic approaches that currently stand out. And the first for me would be the creation of more livable cities. So also things Philipp has already mentioned, strategies that prioritize proximity with the objective of creating polycentric cities of short distances, that prioritize non-polluting modes of transport, the creation of green spaces, and so on. And I think the most discussed plan that is taking this approach at the moment is Paris's 15-minute city. But there are also many other cities like Melbourne, Copenhagen, Utrecht, Portland that have taken similar approaches. And the result of these various plans and strategies is really a visible reduction in mobility, contamination, stress. On the other hand, they foster mixed-use neighborhoods that promote local consumption, and so on. And while a lot of these plans were already underway before the crisis, the need to social distance and the need to redesign public space and reduce mobility has accelerated them, but also placed them at the center of many urban policies and governance strategies. And I think in a lot of cities where these measures were meant to be temporary, we will actually see that they will become more permanent. So, for example, in Paris, I think if Anne Hidalgo wins the mayoral election I think it's next week, I think a lot of the measures she has implemented will become more permanent. I think a second of these holistic approaches are efforts to create circular urban economies. And here Amsterdam is definitely leading the way with its circular strategy that is based on Kate Raworth's donut economics. And the idea here is to develop an economic recovery plan that doesn't only secure livelihoods, but also respects the limits of our planet and of social communities. Of course, this is all very idealistic and ambitious, but at least there is the ambition to move in this direction. And thirdly, I think there is an attempt also to use technological innovation for climate change. And at the same time, use this technological innovation to accelerate economic recovery and promote social equity. So here LA with its Green Deal or Urban Green Deal plan, I think, again, is leading the way. Again, very idealistic, very ambitious, but there is the attempt to change. And I think one of the problems we're going to face in the next couple of years is that all these plans and strategies are being led by very wealthy pioneer cities. And I think the challenge will be to transfer these new modes of operating to poorer and smaller cities with less resources. Thanks.
Thanks, Hannah. Almost all the pieces included in the report highlight the dynamism of cities, building bridges and mechanisms to share experiences and to share knowledge with other cities, and also building alliances with other stakeholders, civil society organizations, international organizations, well, to tackle, analyze, and share those solutions they are providing. This is a question for all the panelists, and I'll ask to give a brief response because we are arriving to the end of this webinar. Why do you think this international collaboration between cities and with other urban stakeholders is even more important now than before the crisis. We can start. We can stay with Hannah. Hannah.
Yeah, I think a couple of the speakers, especially Philipp and Ian, have already touched on this. And I think, firstly, the current crisis is so complex. It's much more complex than anything cities have had to deal with in the past few decades, that it will require a lot of sharing experiences, sharing best practices, joint lobbying or advocacy that represents cities' needs and interests at the national and also international level. And also, I think a point that Philipp raised, which is key, is really counteracting nationalistic tendencies and tendencies of national governments to look inwards rather than outwards.
Susan, you can share your thoughts about that?
I mean, it's interesting because theoretically climate change should have made us recognize that all cities and all urban residents were connected and that we live in one world. And yet I think it's interesting because there's nothing quite like disease to make people really alert to their own connectivity to somebody they may pass the thing on to or receive it from. And the fact that the health of New Yorkers is linked to the health of people in Wuhan, to the people of Lagos, I think really does ram home unequivocally for everybody, not just urban experts, the fact that we are all interconnected. Now, that's not for people who are professionals in the space, that's not new. That's what the Sustainable Development Goals were all about, a universal agenda. Leave no place behind, leave no person behind. But the health dynamic, which is going to be at the forefront of our consciousness politically for the next probably 2 decades, provides an opportunity to think of cities as deeply interconnected places where you should worry about what goes on in Brazil because it will impact on your life, even if you live in Mongolia. And so it's that for me that then raises the question about, okay, so then what is the global dialogue on cities? And that's where we've got to be really smart about ensuring that it doesn't become a blame game and that it does become a discussion about what we can do in particular places that work, but that we can do in every place to ensure our common health and vitality.
Okay, thank you. Ian, maybe you want to add something in this regard?
Sure, just a diplomatic note, I guess. And Philipp is right about nationalism. We all are familiar with the story about rising international collaboration between cities that largely took place in American-led globalization and what people like to call the liberal international order. We've seen it adapt and I would argue strengthen in an international context of revitalized nationalism. And that is an argument in and of itself for such exchange. But I think there's an interesting point to be made here. The city diplomacy and the exchange of policy solutions between cities, which is ultimately its goal for the most part, advocacy too, but it rests on the ability to improve the ability to deliver services and governance and government, has often had identifiable goals, that be they around adaptation, mitigation, or improved government practices. One of the advantages they've had over currently existing international organizations at the national and international scale is that they're more nimble. I think they've showed themselves again here to being more nimble, which is an argument in favor of such collaboration. But there's another one, and Susan makes a case for why we need to have a global consciousness and understand our connectivity. One of the curious things about diplomacy is that you sometimes build the relationships not because you need them then, because you might need them in the future. And the G20 is the classic example of this. It kind of exists in stasis until there's a crisis, and then theoretically it jumps to help address the crisis. One of the interesting things about this pandemic is disease, though part of city network exchange, was in no way the focus of the major city networks, such as Metropolis, who very quickly adapted in a nimble fashion to help cities be active. And so the argument for city diplomacy and exchange between cities isn't just that it solves the problems that you are facing. It will help you solve the problems you don't know that you will be facing, but in fact that you will have to face because we're connected in the way Susan outlined.
Thanks, Ian. Philipp, you want to add something here?
Yeah, so I mean, I already outlined my case, but what I do want to briefly share, because there is always this issue around, yes, international collaboration and sharing information, but on what exactly? And we, at the moment, with a recently launched new emergency governance initiative for cities and regions, jointly with United Cities and Local Governments and Metropolis, so the two networks, we at the LSE are currently looking a bit closer into that. And there's, on the one hand, what cities are currently sharing. We have scanned 60 monitors around the world, and this is primarily on specific practices. By far the most important one on health, followed by economic development, then issues on communication and social services. What these cities at the moment are not doing enough is to really talk specifically around governance issues. And there is a whole range of, there are practices and big debates, of course. Most importantly, maybe finance and resourcing, which, by the way, I think is ultimately about the new urban economy. So it's an economic question. Communication, coordination, all of those typical areas are covered. What at the moment no one really talks about are very big issues where there's also very little clarity of how to deal in an emergency context with. Democracy and representation, public participation and inclusion, and then all the good governance issues. And that should worry us, because in some ways, we know if there's an immediate threat linked to a storm, terrorism, the whole logic is one where you reduce democracy and stakeholder participation to be really fast and rapid. I don't think in these kind of global emergencies, whether it's epidemics or indeed climate change and any other major crises, we can afford going down that route of ultimately being fast by reducing consultation and co-production, as many of my colleagues have outlined.
Okay, thanks a lot, Philipp. We are already out of time, but we have some questions that have been shared by the audience. So we have 3 questions that I will share with you, and you tell me who wants to respond. What has been learned, specific aspects from success, but also from failures by each city that can be useful to face a possible new outbreak or even another urban challenge like climate change? This is, I read the 3 questions, so and you can go through the 3. The second one, to what extent can international agendas, specifically the 2030 agenda, help cities building more effective responses to the economic, social, and climate crisis? And the third one, what role will networks like C40 play in the formulation of cities' recovery strategies? Who wants to respond to the questions?
I'll go for the failures.
Okay, go ahead, Susan. Thank you.
But other than, I mean, I think what is so extraordinary about this moment in terms of learning is that everybody knows they made a failure. And we probably all cities have got more than one failure. But I suspect that there are some common things that have not really been thought about properly. And the one that really strikes me is that we didn't really think about children in the city very much. So that's about schooling. It's about parents who can't go to work when their kids aren't at school. It's about safety. It's about children's future. And it just seems to me that that very obvious point, which is that cities are made up of quite large cohorts of people who are not typically drawn into our planning and into the immediate eye, are a very useful lens through which to think about risk reduction, and whether it's about feeding our children, whether it's about clothing our children, or getting them, educating our children, or creating environments for our children's future. The failure to think about the child and the city seems to me to be one of the things that we have almost all cities have done badly over the last 6 months.
Okay, thank you. Ian, Philipp, Hannah.
I'll go for the one about international agendas. I think in the immediate response to the crisis, international agendas very much moved to the background, and thinking about them was not very relevant. But I think now that we're moving into the recovery stage and cities are beginning to outline their recovery strategies, I think agendas like the 2030 agenda are very helpful. Because a lot of work has already been done on the specific goals and targets, and the goals also include the goal on health, on poverty, on issues that are really vital right now. So I think in their recovery response, cities can build on the work they have already done in the framework of these international agendas, which will be helpful in terms of the formulation of policies and also the implementation.
Thank you. I don't know, Philipp, Ian, you want to add something here?
Ian, let me come in only so that you have the last word. So I will just take this issue, which again links the bridge to climate change. And I think if there's one rather positive and amazing issue around all of this is the extent to which we have all witnessed that we can deal with radical intervention and are indeed appreciative of governments taking radical initiatives. Yes, this was a lot of it was temporarily, but we would have not dreamed that this would ever be possible by a government to regulate for quite some time certain of these measures. And a lot of them were not just bad and horrible, but also include very happy moments, including little happy moments with children. When I go and play tennis in my local street with my kids on almost a daily basis, it's one of those small happy moments. So what does this radicality mean? It means that I think our political leaders are maybe emboldened, encouraged, and maybe also some of the sort of tensions between the public and the private sector, is easing down, because this is a moment, let's face it, for government with T to a large extent, and hopefully, if it's interpreted appropriately, that means much, much better governance with C, which then includes more collaborative, appreciative stakeholders across the spectrum from government, public, private, and third sector.
Great. Ian, do you have a final word?
Susan's point on failure is a really well taken one. I mean, I have to think that I wonder later in life how Bill de Blasio is going to wonder about having gone to the gym on Monday, May 17th, when Californians were sheltering in place. Everyone will have failures and things that they wish they did differently. I think it's impossible not to see ad hoc urban solutions as part of the positive story that emerges from this. They happen almost immediately, whether they were art, signage, restaurants, communities mobilizing in support of each other. I think that instantaneously we've seen the design community come up with new approaches to enable us to enjoy public spaces. And I think that has to be one of the areas that is sort of going to experience a tremendous amount of energy. But I join, I think Philip used the word, I think radical. It's been an act of imagination in terms of what we can do and the pace at which we can do it. The striking thing to me, though, is that won't be done by new organizations that were stood up for this new moment, but rather, I made this point already in this conversation, and it's relevant to the international agreements that were referenced as one of the other questions. They will be made by organizations like C40 and Metropolis. They will be advanced by governments that have already been elected right now, at least immediately, or deterred by governments that have already been elected. And so we're working with a much wider vision of what we can do, but largely within the same institutions and political movements that existed on May 14th, for the most part, I think.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ian. Well, we have to stop here. We are already out of time, as I told you. Thanks to all the audience, the public, for attending the seminar, for sharing questions. Thanks a lot to the 4 panelists Susan, Philipp, Ian, Hannah, of course, for accepting the invitation of being involved and sharing your thoughts and your reflections in the CIDOB report, in our report, but also to be engaged with this seminar. It has been a pleasure. It has been, I think, really inspiring. So thanks a lot. The report is already online. We have a specific site where you can find all the articles together with other resources, and we are also going to launch the booklet, an online version, and also paper version, a version of the report. We at CIDOB, in our Global Cities program, we will continue analyzing all the challenges and the threats that cities are facing. The solutions they are proposing, how international agendas are strengthening or not those solutions, the responses that cities are providing to their citizens. For us, it is crucial. We have focused now on the outbreak, on the COVID-19 outbreak, but now we are facing huge economic, social, and we will continue with a huge climate emergency that will require a full engagement of cities and all the stakeholders that work with cities. So thanks a lot for sharing the seminar with us, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Agustí. Thanks, Hannah.
Bye. Keep in touch.